Hello, and welcome to Planting the Seed, a short series of behind the scenes and extra content episodes to accompany our critically acclaimed audio drama Seeds, which was inspired by the amazing true story of the world's first seed bank. My name is Johanna Taylor, the Executive Director and Producer of No Stone Theatre, who made this series, and today I'll be in conversation with the creative team behind the show. I'll let everyone introduce themselves as you listen to an open conversation we had recently, which takes in the history of the project from its theatre origin to turning it into a podcast. We'll get some insights into the material and the team's creative process.
We're editing anyway, so I'm going to just start from I'm joined with.
Go for it.
My name's Johanna Taylor. I'm the Executive Director of No Stone Theatre and the producer of Seeds. I'm here with Nick Pitt, Nick Walker and Jon Ouin. Nick Pitt, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Nick Pitt, and I'm the artist director of No Stone Theatre and the director of Seeds, which is obviously now a podcast which started life as a play.
I'm Nick Walker, I'm a writer and I was looking after the text for Seeds.
I'm Jon Ouin and I'm a composer, sound designer occasionally, and so that's what I was doing here for Seeds. Sorry, that was terrible.
No, that was perfect. Awesome. So let's just jump straight in with the questions. Nick Pitt, the first question is for you. Where did you first find out about Vavilov and his story?
A friend of mine had heard this sort of brief summary of I think it was on the radio, this incredible story of this geneticist, this man called Vavilov, and the incredible idea that he created the world's first seed bank. And I just started to look into it and I sort of researched it more and quickly became sort of really just obsessed and fascinated with just the extreme poetry of what happened, and this idea of starving in a room full of food to preserve the future of humanity in some way, which is just so sort of like mad and poetic, and also sort of incredibly sort of theatrical in the way that it's a very sort of dynamic theatre space. This like what we sometimes call in theatre sort of dramaturgy terms would be like a closed time, closed space story. So it was the duration of the siege in terms of the time it took to happen, and they were all essentially locked in a series of rooms in this big institute in the centre of the city. But what they were doing in that room was interacting with and preserving and organising and worrying and thinking about something so simple and small as a wheat seed, which obviously we know goes on to become bread, which goes on to feed sort of everyone all over the world in some way. So it felt like it just had this amazing sort of intersection of resonances across like the objects, the story, the time, and then the sort of, you know, obviously as a practitioner, as a sort of maker, I think it's important in my work to sort of find the contemporary lens or the contemporary relevance for these historical stories. And, you know, tragically at the moment we are sort of reaping what we've sown in terms of the degradation of the environment and the natural world, and biodiversity, species loss, and its intersection with climate change, and our nutrition as a species has incredibly sort of like come to the fore in the last few years. And I think early on I came across a stat which I think sort of sums up again some of the sort of like deep poetry of this, which is that I think there's 1 billion people in the world, 100 million people, probably more right now actually because of the current pandemic, but hundreds of millions of people are malnourished or starving, cannot access enough food to survive. But 1 billion people in the world are technically obese. So we still live in a world where the idea of like being able to find enough food and be able to do the most basic facet of survival, which is to feed yourself, is either too easy and we spend all the money we have on becoming eating too much, or impossible. And those people in that room in St. Petersburg, in Leningrad, sort of, I guess, some of the things that they did were a warning about how we needed to respect the natural world more, respect the different species of plant and animal, and do our best to try and I guess their mission was to try and end world famine, and sadly we haven't been able to do that, and now it looks like it might be even harder to do that. So that's a very long answer to your question. but that is where I found the story.
Amazing, thank you. Awesome. And of course you brought that idea to me when we were talking about starting up our first project as
We
No
did,
Stone.
yes.
Yeah, and what was that, over coffee in Pret in central London. And that was, I remember you telling me about it, and I remember being really interested and slightly confused to begin with, because I don't think I knew what a seed bank was, and I didn't really have any contextual information. But even without any of that basic knowledge, the story still sort of sang to me. We kind of started work together to kind of bring the story to life a bit, didn't we? So I'd like to ask you to tell us a bit about the values behind the creative process for the podcast.
Sure.
Obviously, I know that will tie in a lot as well with the original R&Ds for the theatre show, but how you encouraged the team to work together, and just your general thoughts around that.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Yeah, well, as you say, yeah, it was a project which I guess by its very nature, because of the sort of sort of vastness of the story and the sort of like the opportunity to tell such an amazing little known story, meant that I think it needed to be matched with ambition. So obviously, as a sort of as a vehicle to sort of explore it, me and you founded the company No Stone, and very quickly started to think about how we could go from essentially just an idea and these bits of research to something which was the beginnings of a journey into something which would be initially a piece of hopefully really compelling live performance. So I guess in theatre world, again, like we do a lot of research and development, or R&D. So most of the time a new play, whether it's like a really sort of text-led process or whether it's something more devised or physical, starts life in an R&D. And so that was what obviously we wanted to do that, but I was very keen to do that in our sort of own way, and our sort of find our own particular process, just as a company, but also as for this particular show. So I've worked with the two people I've joined with here. We were joined with today on several other projects, and Nick and Jon, and knew straight away that they were the two people I wanted to be sort of marshalling the sound and the text for this project. And we also at that stage worked with a designer and a movement director as well, so with Lulu Wang and Dan Canham in the first phase. And that was because I didn't just want this to be, because in many ways we could tell the story of Vavilov and the Institute in a sort of more typical dramaturgical play. Basically we could write a sort of biopic, I guess, if you like, because we had the information to do that, and we could probably tell a relatively familiar story in the sense and the way it was told. So tell it in a familiar way, and I'm sure it would have been great. But what I thought was crucial is actually, because it sort of goes deeper than that, and because we have this contemporary connection by the fact that every one of us goes to the supermarket and engages with these sort of the produce and food production, and sort of and all of us as humans have to eat, all the way through to the sort of vastness of the story and to the sort of impact on climate change. I felt like it was bigger than just a sort of one person's opinion through some text. So I wanted the text not to lead the process, and instead I wanted the very, very keenly wanted to sort of open it up initially to sort of the sort of initial responses of other disciplines, so of music and sound, of movement and of visual design, and I guess and performance. So we worked very collaboratively as a creative team with a great group of sort of devising collaborative actors, some of which who are still in the show now, who still play some of the characters that you've heard by listening. And I guess you just sort of having to be very open to not knowing exactly where you're headed at that stage. And to do that, we wanted to basically find the right form. So when we say form, it's like what shape and sort of like mechanism you use to tell the story. So would it be at that stage it could have maybe ended up as a really vivid sort of tight Chekhovian like drama with big characters with big backstories, but at the same time maybe it was going to end up as something purely physical, and it would just be all movement, and we wanted to find out through exploring it together and basically allowing each other's responses to lead our responses what that best form was. And that was, I guess, what we did. And I'm sure maybe it's interesting to see what how Nick and Jon found that experience when we were sort of working theatrically, and I guess hopefully how we carried that through to the podcast as well.
Thanks, Nick. I think for now, I'd be really interested to know first what Nick and Jon, your sort of initial thoughts were when you were approached by Nick with this idea.
Well, I have had the great fortune of working with Nick on a few previous devised kind of collaborative theatre projects. So when he approached me with this, I suppose there was some hopefully some degree of creative trust there that was already extant. But one of the things about this particular project was that for me personally, it combines two really massive interests of mine, one of which is, well, I mean, it's, I suppose, just Russia generally, but I mean, in particular, this is obviously Soviet Russia, but some of the music that was being made during the time frame that Nick was talking about, well, for the idea for the piece, in particular, really interests me. And as it happened, just around that time, I had again the fortune of being able to work on a couple of sort of musical documentaries about sort of avant-garde music made at the time in Soviet Russia, sort of during the war. There were the very first synthesizers, and so in my head there was already this this sort of sound world. But I have to say I didn't know anything about biodiversity, and I'm still learning right now. But for me there was a lot of things that came together. So obviously this general interest in Soviet Russia, and then and the music of the time, and
well, I'll jump in just to say, hilariously, I mean, I had no idea that Jon had just made a documentary for the World Service about Russian experimental music, written at the exact time that we were looking at staging in some way. So that was a delightful surprise. But Jon always also, I mean, I was happy to work with Jon on this because I knew that his sort of like, I didn't realise I had such a Russian expert as well as a brilliant composer, which meant that also during recording it's meant that Jon has been able to tell us how Russian words are pronounced, even though I'm afraid there probably will still be some erroneous mispronounced words in there, but actually having a Russian speaker as well has been incredibly useful, but not initially intended.
Just this irritating voice, pedantic voice in the corner. But I think I've sort of said my piece. So hand over to Nick W.
Cool. Go on, Nick. Do you want to give us your thoughts?
Well, I think I'd met you both in a different incarnation at the one theatre we'd worked at, but I think I had to sort of come across C-Bank before. Another project that I'd been involved with was looking at sort of seed banks in Norway, but I had no idea of the origin of it. So it was a really sort of rich addition to why it was that people, all over the world were kind of creating these seed banks and taking such care and attention over trying to preserve as many samples as possible. And I sort of felt that it was a bit of a niche interest. It's like there was something that seemed like a kind of collector thing. I thought it was in that world, but having been exposed to sort of the start of it and realizing this creeping realization of what exactly was at stake with all this stuff, became just suddenly a project which was just growing in its sort of urgency and profundity. And actually at a certain point, it became a kind of, sort of like an irresistible project, really. And that was also speaking to the opportunity that it felt that we were offered by how we could tell it, because of the things that Nick's already mentioned, which was that the origins of it happened under these other extreme circumstances where we have this siege during the Second World War, and the things that they were trying to do at the time were just so incredibly heightened by the pressures on Leningrad at the time. And then also trying to sort of fight for the hierarchy of this seed bank in amongst all the other very urgent priorities that the city was undergoing at the time. And it felt like that particular moment was really similar to the ones that we were experiencing now. Is that how do you fight for this kind of stuff when people have so many other things to think about and preoccupy themselves with? So yeah, it felt intuitively that what Nick and Johanna were bringing to the table, for me anyway, was a kind of particular moment in history about an enormous thing. And so that was absolutely fascinating. And then it became a process of, well, how do we capture a form to tell this story, and what on earth do we get people to say? And and obviously this podcast form has we can be very intimate about that, but the process for finding the words for this sort of enormous issue and finding the characters and calibrating all that, and then trying to sort of make sure that it linked to the contemporary world we live in has been the process forced on us by COVID of moving from the theatrical to the podcast world, and it's led to where we are now.
How did you find this shift to digital and to working remotely as well, when obviously so much of what you do is so embedded in human interaction and physically being in a physical space together? How did you find that shift?
Yeah, I guess, well, I think, it's interesting, isn't it? I think we've all had to adapt so much, and so I think, I think firstly it's an amazing privilege and sort of opportunity to sort of be able to have a project to adapt and to work on. So first, I think I'm just very grateful for that, because I think in this sort of, initial, lockdown months, it was great to have a focus to do something. I think it's also worth saying that they I think we're obviously the reason we decided to adapt the show that was almost we had over an hour of sort of stage material by the time that the lockdown happened, having done two sort of quite meaty R&Ds, and have actually sort of got pretty much an hour of consistent performance. It felt like it would be a real, because of the sort of future being so uncertain with live performance, it felt like it was really important that this work that was so much more relevant thematically and sort of like it had such a connection to some of the experiences we were suddenly hurtling into as people, that it needed to sort of not just sort of wait quietly and to hoping that maybe one day we could get back to it, but then obviously at the same time I think it's important to say that the decision to turn it into an audio drama and a podcast and sort of make it episodic was all felt really right for this story and right for this project, and I'm sure maybe the other guys have some opinions on that. So initially I think that the transition to sort of turn it into something like this digitally firstly felt like it was the right thing to do, and actually despite the slight awkwardness of not being able to sort of meet up in a room and write on a whiteboard or on big pieces of paper and sort of talk as we normally would, we were able to achieve that quite as we all know, right? As we all know from this is how we sort of socialize now in many ways, and how we all collaborate, and how we do so many things that, like we're doing now, we're speaking over the internet to each other. So quickly that became, and because I think we all care about the project so much, and we all cared about the story, and we all had made these crucial discoveries from the development process already. So we already knew the characters, we already knew the sound, we knew the sort of like language, and we knew we had this really interesting challenge about the form which we had for theatre, but we needed to somehow distill it further and to maintain the form that we found, but put it into the new medium of just audio, which straight away I think as makers that's a great challenge. So that was really exciting, and so I think from the collaborative writing process and sort of working out how we would tell the story and how we'd do the episodes, that felt very in a way that felt quite that didn't feel too different. But then actually, I think it actually ended up being, because it became a very intense writing and editing process between myself and Nick. And in many ways, I think if we'd been in a situation which is more traditional, where we might have had maybe been doing that in and around rehearsals or in and around the room, I don't think we would have quite been afforded the same focus and sort of intensity, because we really were able to. I think, I don't know how many times we rewrote the whole thing, Nick, but it was quite a lot, and that was a sort of gift. And I guess because we were sort of in our own time frame, because working digitally, there isn't the same schedules and pressures that you might have when you're working with live performance. Opening night is opening night, and that's not going to shift. So we actually were able to be a little bit flexible with that process, and then what we're able to do is actually work up episodes, and then I would record them on my own, the whole thing. I play every part and send that to Jon, and Jon was then able to sort of make essentially demos, if you like, and actually sort of start mapping out whole episodes, with all the sound and the music as well. And then we would listen to that, and then we would respond to that, and Nick would respond to that, and we'd basically pieced it together. And that was a really live process, and it was really rewarding and really brilliant to be part of. It just, I think it's the sort of what it felt like to do it was, I think, like, I guess everybody listening, we all know, it's just that slightly weird, intense thing of that we're all just sat in our rooms, our brains are in these amazing places, working on this material, or very detailed work that we were doing, and then we'd close the computer or put down the phone, and then we'd just be in our kitchen, ready to make dinner. And that's obviously strange, because we'd normally have that really wonderful opportunity to maybe go for a drink afterwards, or there might be the commute or the journey somewhere which would also sort of disrupt the day. So I guess that was different. And then I'll just say briefly, in terms of then recording the actors, which was obviously the sort of the biggest difference, I suppose, as a director, because normally that's the sort of bit of the job you sort of tend to be most relish the most, because it's the bit you probably why people become directors is to direct actors and rehearse with them. And ironically, and this is particularly aimed at any aspiring young directors out there, the sad thing is that you'll probably end up doing that the least in terms of your weeks in the year. You'll probably spend the shortest amount of time will actually be with actors. So obviously not to be with them in a room and not to be able to do some of the more full physical stuff with them is difficult. But then again, we were just able to communicate over the internet. We all heard each other clearly, and there were times when I felt that I was the only person not with them, because of how sort of detailed and sort of focused the work became, which was great and a privilege, in many ways. But yeah, I guess not having that natural physical communication with someone, it's just like anything. Again, like we all can relate to this. Having a meeting on Zoom is great, but you don't quite have that immediate communication with how someone's thinking or feeling. And so when you're working with someone on their performance, you have to sometimes, I guess I didn't always feel so I didn't always feel very I guess I sometimes didn't feel as close to them as I'd want to, and reactive. But then again, the actors who we work with, like everyone, when we worked with Nina Sasonia on her own, that was basically just me and Nina in our two respective bedrooms for 2 days, working on all the bits of the patient narrator figure. So actually, we'd found our own sort of language that meant that I think we were able to get an incredible amount done incredibly quickly in incredibly focused way. And then working on the institute scenes with the 4 actors of Katie, Jordan, Graham, and Kirsty. Again, amazingly, like you just sort of like that natural sort of rhythm sort of came out in its own way. And by the end there were rehearsal in jokes. There was that back and forth, and that that sort of playfulness, which is what you want really. And if anything, it was maybe even more focused than normal, because they weren't able to have little private conversations and stuff like that. But ultimately, I can't wait to be back in a rehearsal room. But at the same time, it's a real privilege to be able to still tell the story like this.
Awesome, thank you. And I think for Nick, Walker, and Jon, I think conveniently both of you two are already quite experienced when it comes to working for radio and podcasts and that sort of digital sphere. But obviously for everybody it was new working virtually and remotely. So for you guys, do you have any particular thoughts or learnings or takeaways or comments that you kind of have from the process in that aspect, or just general ones actually? Nick, do you want to start?
Well, I think we just had to adjust to two different, kind of not radically different, but certainly distinctly different forms. And some of the things that we made in the theatre context, which was, alive to an audience that was physically there in front of you, it was really about how do we, what is the equivalent of that in this new form that we now will be making the work. And so a lot of thought and discussion went into what is the story now in this new form, how do we tell it, and what new opportunities do we have for engaging with a listener that is in a different, equally intimate, possibly sort of intimate sort of relationship with it, but also in a relationship that we have no control over. So working out how to tell the story in this new form was a sort of really crucial early part of the development of this project, from sort of transferring it from the theatre to the audio drama world. And once we found our mechanism, once we'd sort of set up our world properly, then there was a really sort of flowing moment where we then retold our story in this new world. We'd created a new character for it, which Nick mentioned, sort of, Nina anchors as the patient in this story. There was a theatrical version of that character, but it was a bit unformed. And actually, if we'd have been able to carry on with the theatre process, we might have developed that in similar ways. Who knows what the kind of lost ghost version of the real theatre version of this was, because we were only really kind of 2/3 of the way of the way through it. And then this happened, and so we reinvented at a point when the theatre process hadn't actually finished. So when we go back to theatre, it'd be interesting to see how the podcast informs that process. But either way, it became a much bigger, I think, the larger scope, being remotely and being able to sort of record, as it were, the performance over a shorter period of time than maybe a theatre one, means that the actual content of it is probably doubled in size. So, the story we're telling is now over, probably over 2 hours, whereas it might have been 1 hour in a theatre context, which means that the material is greater. Actually, perhaps the depth of it, we can tell different sorts of things. The form that we've got now is a sort of 2 hour story. So we're telling different kinds of stories in a different way, which has been about us understanding how the original impetus fits with the form in which we are now telling it. And actually, I think we've all become really excited by this episodic way of telling it. We've really engaged with the digital mechanism in this new world of how we might tell this story. I love this digital tour idea, but it's a very different form. We've got sort of 7 hooks in this story, where we might have had different kind of rhythms in the theatre piece. And so I think for all of us, it became an initial, what's the audio version of this play, into a really deep consideration of what a different form does to how you tell a story. And I think even though we've had loads of different experiences that we've brought to this, I think we feel that we've had to relearn all of our storytelling assumptions and mechanisms, and so that we could try and make something that was, sort of really fresh and vibrant in the ear, and was something that was true to the initial impetus of this immense idea. And that's been the deep thing for me about it, in that it's ballooned completely, and what seemed like initially an initial transfer from a theatre process to an audio one suddenly became just kind of a massive reinvention of the project.
Yeah, completely. I just agree, but that's probably not useful for you, Joe, is it?
Yes, we're editing
It's
that
good to make it
straight
feel
out.
like a discussion.
Yeah.
Yes.
I don't want to. Yeah.
Awesome.
It was such a privilege communicating this story to thousands of people all over the world and joining the podcast and audio drama community. You can listen to every episode of Seeds on our website, nostonetheatre.com, or on iTunes, Spotify, or your preferred podcast app. Help us reach even more listeners by subscribing, sharing with your friends and family, and following us on social media at No Stone Theatre. You can also join our mailing list to be the first to receive exclusive content like this interview, as well as announcements and updates on upcoming projects. Seeds is a No Stone Theatre production and was made possible with funding from Arts Council England.